This is another story out of the 1939 edition of Big Book, the first edition. It's called The European Drinker, written by Joe Doppler in Akron, Ohio. I was born in Europe, in Alsace to be exact, shortly after it had become German, and practically grew up with good Rhine wine of song and story. My parents had some vague ideas of making a priest out of me, and some years I attended the Franciscan school of Basel, Switzerland, just across the border, about 6 miles from my home. But although I was a good Catholic, the monastic life had little appeal for me. Very early, I became apprenticed to harness making and acquired considerable knowledge of upholstery. My daily consumption of wine was about a quart, but there was some but that was common where I lived. Everybody drank wine, and it was true that there was no great amount of drunkenness, but I can remember in my teens that there were a few characters who caused the village heads to nod pityingly and sometimes in anger as they paused to say, "That sot Henry, compoor of Jules, who drank too much." They were undoubtedly the alcoholics of our village. Military service was compulsory, and I did my stretch with the class of my age, goose-stepping in German barracks and taking part in in the Boxer Rebellion in China. My first time at great distance from home. In foreign parts, many a soldier who's been abstemious at home learns to use new and potent drinks, so I indulged with my comrades in everything the Far East had to offer. I cannot say, however, that I acquired any craving for hard liquor as a result. When I got back to Germany, I settled down to finish my apprenticeship, drinking the wine of the country as usual. Many friends of my family had immigrated to America, so at 24, I decided that the United States offered me the opportunity I was never likely to find in my native land. I came directly to a growing industrial city in the Midwest, where I've lived practically ever since. I was warmly welcomed by friends in my youth who had preceded me. For weeks after my arrival, I was fed and entertained in the already large colony of the Alsatians in that city. Among the Germans in their saloons and clubs, I early decided that the wine of America was very inferior stuff and took up beer instead. I soon found work at my trade in harness making. It was still an age of horses, but I discovered that harness and saddle making in America was different from anything I had known. Every man in the shop was a specialist, and instead of having a variety of jobs to do every day, I was compelled to sit all day at a bench doing the same thing endlessly. I found it very monotonous, and wanting a change, I found it when I got I found it when I got work as an upholsterer in a large furniture store. Fond of singing, I joined a German singing society, which had a good club headquarters. There I sat in the evenings, enjoying with my friends our memories of the old country, singing the old songs we all knew, playing simple card games for drinks, and consuming great quantities of beer. At that time, I could go into any saloon, have one or two beers, walk out, and forget about it. I had no desire whatever to sit down at a table and stay a whole morning or afternoon drinking. Certainly at that time, I was one of those who could take it or leave it alone. There had never been any drunkards in my family. I came of good stock, of men and women who drank wine all their lives as a beverage, and while they occasionally got drunk at special celebrations, they were up and about their business the next day. Prohibition came. Having regard for the law of the land, I resigned myself to the will of the national legislators and quit drinking altogether. Not because I found it harmful, but because I couldn't get what I was accustomed to drink. You can all remember that in the first few months after the change, a great many men who had formerly been used to a few beers every day and an occasional drink of whiskey simply quit all alcoholic drinks. For the great majority of us, however, that that condition didn't last. We saw very early that prohibition wasn't going to work. It wasn't very long before home brewing was an institution and began to search and men began to search feverishly for old recipe books on winemaking. But I hardly tasted anything for 2 years and started in business for myself, founding a mattress factory, which is today an important industrial enterprise in our city. I was doing very well with that and general upholstering work, and there was every indication that I would be financially independent by the time I reached my middle age. By this time, I was married and was paying for a home. Like most immigrants, I wanted to be somebody and have something, and I was very happy and contented as I felt success crown my efforts. I missed the old social times, of course, but had no definite craving even for beer. Successful home brewers among my friends began to invite me to their homes. I decided if these fellows could make it, I would try it myself, and so I did. It wasn't very long until I developed a pretty good brew with uniformity and plenty of authority. I knew the stuff I was making was a lot stronger than I'd been used to, but never suspected that steady drinking of it might develop a taste for something even stronger. It wasn't long before the bootlegger was an established institution in this and other towns. I was doing well in business, and going around town, I was frequently invited to have a drink in a speakeasy. I conditioned my domestic brewing and the bootleggers and their business. More and more, I formed the habit of doing some of my business in the speakeasy, and after a time did not need that as an excuse. The speaks usually sold whiskey. Beer was too bulky and it couldn't be kept in a jug under the counter ready to be dumped when John Law would come around. I was now forming an entirely new drinking technique. Before long, I had a definite taste for hard liquor, new nausea and headaches I had never known before, but as in the old days, I suffered them out. Gradually, however, I'd suffer so much that I simply have had the morning after drink. I suffered so much, I simply had to have the morning after drink. I became what is called a periodical drinker. I was eased out of the business. I had rounded and was reduced to doing general upholstery in a small shop at the back of my house. My wife upbraided me often plenty when she saw that my periodicals were gradually losing me. What business could I get? Gradually losing what business I could get. I began to bring bottles in. I had them hidden away in the house and all over my shop in careful concealment. I had all the usual experiences of the alcoholic, for I was certainly one by this time. Sometimes after sobering up, after a bout of several weeks, I would righteously resolve to quit. With a great deal of determination, I would throw out all of my pints, pour them out, smash the bottles firmly, resolved never to take another drink of the stuff. I was going to straighten up. In 4 or 5 days, I would be hunting all over the house, at home, and in my workshop for the bottles I'd destroyed, cursing myself for being a damn fool. My periodicals became more frequent until I reached the point where I wanted to devote all my time to drinking, working as little as possible, and then only when the necessity of my family demanded it. As soon as I had satisfied that, when I earned as an upholsterer, what I earned as an upholsterer went for liquor. I promised to have jobs done and never do them. My customers lost confidence in me to the point where I retained what business I had only because I was a well trained and reputedly fine craftsman. Best in the business when he's sober, my customers would say. And I still had a following who would give me work, though they deplored my habits because they knew the job would be well done when they eventually got it. I'd always been a good Catholic, possibly not so devoted as I should have been, but fairly regular in my attendance of services. I had never doubted the existence of the Supreme Being, but now I began to absent myself from church. where I had formerly been a member of the choir. Unfortunately, I had no desire to consult my priest about my drinking. In fact, I was so scared to talk to him about it, for I feared the kind of talk he would give me. Unlike many other Catholics who frequently take pledges for definite periods a year, 2 years, or for good, I never had any desire to take a pledge before the priest. And yet, realizing at last that liquor really had me, I wanted to quit. My wife wrote away for advertised cures for the liquor habit and gave me to them in coffee. I even got myself I even got them myself and tried them. None of the various cures of this kind were any good. My experiences differ very little from the experiences of other alcoholics, but if ever a man was firmly in the grip of a power that could lead only to ruin and disgrace, I was that man. I had the usual array of friends who tried to stop me in my drinking career. I can hear them yet, kindly for the most part, yet blind and almost wholly without understanding. They had the approach that every alcoholic knows. Can't you be a man? You can cut it out. You've got a good wife. You could have the best business in town. What's the matter with you anyway? Every alcoholic has heard those familiar phrases from well meaning friends. And they were my friends too. In their way, they did what they could, helped me at different times to get on my feet after a particularly bad time, aided me in unraveling my tangled business affairs, suggested this, suggested that. They all wanted to help me, but none of them knew. Not one of them had the answer I wanted. My wife got talking to a local merchant one day. He was known as a deeply religious man. He was undoubtedly a fundamentalist with strong leanings toward evangelistic preaching. He knew me and something of my reputation. My wife asked him to help her if he could. So he came to see me, bringing a friend along. He found me drunken in bed. This man had never been an alcoholic, and his approach to me was the familiar one of the emotional seeker after souls. Well, there I was, lying in an alcoholic stupor, with occasional flashes of emotional self-pity, in pretty much the same condition as the drunk who plunges to the sawdust at the appeal of a religious orator. Good, honest, and sincere man, he prayed at my bedside and I promised to go to church with him to hear an evangelist. He didn't wait for me to come to his office. He came after me. I heard the evangelist, but was not impressed. The service was entirely foreign to what I had been accustomed to in my religious observance since childhood. I have no doubt of the preacher's sincerity and seek not at all to belittle his work, but I was unaffected, so I got no answer. There are alcoholics who have been without any consciousness of God all their lives. There are some who are actual haters of the idea of the Supreme Being. Others, like myself, who have never given up a belief in the Almighty, who have always felt that God is far off. And that's the way I felt. I had a closer sense of God during the Mass at church, a feeling of his presence. But in everyday life, he seemed to be at a distance from me, and more as a righteous judge than an all-wise, pitying father to the human race. Then occurred the event that saved me. An alcoholic came to see me who was a doctor. He didn't talk like a preacher at all. In fact, his language was perfectly suited to my understanding. He had no desire to know anything except whether I was definite about my desire to quit drinking. I told him with all the sincerity at my command that I did. Even then, he went on no great detail about he and a crowd of alcoholics with whom he associated had mastered their difficulty. Instead, he told me that some of them wanted to talk to me and would be over to see me. This doctor had imparted his knowledge to just a few other men at the time, not more than 4 or 5. They number more than 70 persons now. And because, as I have discovered since, it is part of the treatment that these men he sent to see and talk with alcoholics who want to quit, he kept them busy. He'd already imbued them with his own spirit until they were ready and willing at all times to go where sent. And as a doctor, he well knew that this mission and duty would strengthen them as it later helped me. The visits from these men impressed me at once. Where preaching and prayers had touched me very little, I was immediately impressed with desire for further knowledge from these men. There must be something to it, I said to myself. Why would these busy men take the time to come and see me? They understand my problem. Like me, they've tried this remedy and that remedy, but never found one that worked. But whatever it is, they're using it now. It seems to keep them sober. Certainly, I could see they were sober. The third man who came to see me had been one of the biggest business getters his company had ever employed. From the top of the heap, in a few years, he'd skidded to becoming a shuffling customer, still entering the better bar rooms, but welcomed by neither mine host nor his patrons. His own business was practically gone, he told me, when he discovered the answer. You've been trying man's ways, and they always fail, he told me. You can't win unless you try God's way. I never heard of the remedy expressed in just this language. In a few sentences, he made God seem personal to me. He explained him as a being who was interested in me, the alcoholic, and that all I needed to do was be willing to follow his way for me. That as long as I followed it, he would be able to overcome my desires for liquor. Well, there I was, willing to try it, but I didn't know how, except in a vague way. I knew something that it meant more than just going to church and living a moral life. If that was all, then I was a little doubtful that it was the answer I was looking for. He went on talking and told me that he had found the plan as a basis of love and the practice of Christ's injunction. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Taking that as a foundation, he reasoned if a man followed that rule, he could not be selfish. I could see that. And he further said that God could accept me as a sincere follower of his divine law. Excuse me, let me reread that. He said, God could not accept me as a sincere follower of his divine law unless I was ready to be thoroughly honest about it. That was perfectly logical. My church taught that. I'd always known that in theory. We talked too about personal morals. Every man has his problem of this kind, but we didn't discuss it very much. My visitor well knew that as I tried to follow God, I would get to studying these things out for myself. We talked things over for a long time. I saw readily that I couldn't afford to quibble. I already believed in God, had always done so, was ready to give my will to him. That's what it came to. That day I gave my will to God and asked to be directed. But I had never thought of that as something to do and then forget about. I very early came to see that there had to be continued renewal of that simple deal with God, that I had perpetually had to keep the bargain. So if I began to pray to place my problems in God's hands, for a long time I kept on trying in a pretty dumb way at first, I know, but very earnestly I didn't want to be a fake, and I began putting in practice what I was learning every day. It wasn't very long until my doctor friend sent me to tell another alcoholic what my experience had been. This duty, together with my weekly meetings with my fellow alcoholics and my daily renewal of the contract I'd originally made with God, have kept me sober when nothing else ever did. I've been sober for many years now. The first few months were hard. Many things happened. Business trials, little worries, feelings of general despondency came near driving me to the bottle. But I made progress. As long as I had seen to get strength daily to be able to resist more easily, as long as I go along, let me reread that. As I go along, I seem to get strength daily to be able to resist more easily. And when I get upset, cross-grained, and out of tune with my fellow man, I know that I'm out of tune with God. Searching where I've been at fault, it is not hard to discover and get right again. For I've proven to myself and to many others who know me that God can keep a man sober if he'll let him. Being a Catholic, it's natural that I should attend my own church, which I do regularly. I partake of its sacraments, which have a new, deeper meaning to me now. I realize what it is to be in the presence of God right in my own home. I realize it deeply when I'm at church. For when a man is truly trying to do God's will instead of his own, he is very conscious of being in the presence of God always, wherever he may be. Join me in the Lord's Prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Give us all this day our daily bread. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Forgive us for our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Forgive us for our debts as we forgive our debtors. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory, forever and forever, from age until ages. Amen and amen.